we thought that, this was going to be a struggle that would continue in a sense, I guess, forever. I think that many of us felt that way. I kind of thought that I'd found a lifetime career, and I'm glad that I haven't. I'm glad that it's pretty much over in that sense. Very happy to have been wrong about that. But in a certain way, there were signs, and you can see the signs much more clearly looking back to the future rather than when they were happening. Back in June, some of us were participants in an event called 5 Days for the Five in Washington. And we went to congressional offices. And this was the third year that this had happened. And I remember the first year, I think, there were about 20 offices that got visited. And people ended up talking to low-level staffers in the offices who really had no idea about the Cuban Five. And when the Cuban Five story was explained to them, they really weren't interested. By last June, things had really changed in many ways. There were 60 congressional visits during that period of time. And not only were people interested, but many of them knew something about the Cuban Five. And in fact, one person that we ran into, I remember, said to us, in my local community before coming to Washington, I was a member of the Free the Five committee. That was something that we had not experienced before at all. We even got a session to talk to people in the State Department. And again, that had never happened before. It was a very interesting conversation. We were talking to somebody who was I think he was the coordinator of the Office of Cuban Affairs or something. He was a senior official in there. And he was very polite and respectful. He kept referring to the Five as these spies. Alicia Rapko from the International Committee, who was sort of leading the delegation, would correct him. They were not spies, they were intelligence agents. By the end of about an hour, he somehow slipped in, talked about these intelligence agents. And then he turned to us and he smiled and he said, that in my next meeting I'm going to talk about them again as spies. And he probably did. But it was a sign, I think, that there was a slow change in tone in Washington. And there was something else that happened during those meetings that perhaps, again, should have seen that something was going on. And that was, we were sitting in a meeting with a congressman who was talking about a meeting that he had with a guy by the name of Jeff De Laurentiis, who was the new head of the U.S. interest section in Havana. And Alicia leaned over and said to me, "He's in your book." And I looked at her and I was puzzled, and I didn't know what she was talking about. I said that a couple times, and it turned out that yes, he was in my book. I had forgotten about it entirely, but Gerardo had not. And Gerardo Hernandez had brought it up to the Alicia at some point during a visit. And what it turned out was that Jeff De Laurentiis, the new head of the U.S. interest section, had served in the White House back in 1998 when Gabriel Garcia Marquez came to tell Bill Clinton about the plot to blow up an airplane bringing tourists to Cuba. We didn't know what that meant, but in fact, it did mean something. It meant that somebody who knew about the case of the Cuban Five was in a more important position. And I think that in retrospect, that was probably significant. And only Gerardo Hernandez actually noticed that, which I think is also significant. The other things that happened in the lead up to the release of the Five that I didn't see at the time, but I see now, Alan Gross, who, as you know, was the U.S. aid contractor who was in jail in Cuba, I had been trying to interview him, and without a great deal of success. I mean, I thought, it was important to interview him as well. And so at one point I talked, I guess it was last September, with somebody in the interest section in Washington, and we were having a good conversation, and I said this thing, I'd really like to interview Alan Gross. And he said, I think that's probably a really good idea. I think it's probably the right time. I'll talk to Havana and see what's going on. I was very enthused. The next morning he came to me and said, no, we don't think it's the right time. And a couple of months later in November, if you remember, Alan Gross was arrested in early December of 2009. And so I thought that I would write a story about Judy Gross, his wife, because I was really interested in her evolution. She had started out blaming the Cubans for everything and had come around to recognize that it was the American government that was largely responsible for the fact that her husband was still in jail. And I wanted to talk to her, and we had developed a kind of email correspondence, and she'd been very, very kind and very thoughtful in some of the correspondence. And I said, to mark the anniversary, I would really like to talk to you about what's happening with Alan and your own evolution of viewpoints. And she didn't get back to me. This first time she didn't get back to me, her lawyer did. And he said, we would like to talk to you at some point, but now is not the time. I think because there have been so many false starts in this process of freeing the five, that I didn't really, again, recognize it for what it was. The last piece of the puzzle that I should have seen and didn't see involved the Guantanamo prisoners who were transferred about a week before the five were released. And if you remember, Jose Mujica, the president of Uruguay, had offered to the White House about a year ago, we will take some of your Guantanamo prisoners that you can't find a home for, and we'll let them come to live in Uruguay, but we really think you should release those 3 remaining members of the Cuban Five. And then on December 11th, when this all transpired, nobody mentioned the Cuban Five. Mm-hmm. And I thought, wait a minute, why isn't somebody talking about the Cuban Five? And it's clear that the reason they weren't talking about the Cuban Five was that things were happening in the background that I clearly didn't see. So then December 17th happens, and I was intrigued by the little conversations we had around here about how people found out. This is sort of like a Kennedy moment. You know, it's that kind of thing, only it's much happier than that. Everybody knows where they were when it happened. Yes. For me, I was in a meeting. It's an important meeting about the future of the university where I work, and so nothing was supposed to disturb what was going on in that meeting. And then my cell phone rang, and of course that's the embarrassing thing. Your cell phone rings, and you're trying to reach for it. And I saw that the phone call was from Alicia Repko, and from the International Committee. And we had been talking back and forth about an event that was going to happen in February in Washington. And so I figured that that's what this was about, and I, hit the button and turned off the phone, or tried to turn off the phone, and got back to the meeting. And about 30 seconds later, my cell phone exploded with tweets and beeps and all sorts of things, and I was trying to shut up. I only got to one message, and it was from CNN. CNN has a way of burying the lead, if you know what I'm going to say, because what they said in the message was, Alan Gross has just been released. We would like to talk to you this afternoon. That was the last message I got for an hour because I had to turn off the phone. And so for an hour, I didn't know what that meant. I thought it was probably going to be good news, and we were talking about the Puerto Ricans and how the release back in the 70s happened where, the U.S. releases prisoners, and then 5 days later the Cubans release prisoners. And I thought, okay, maybe this is what's happening here. I did not believe that the Cubans would release Alan Gross without something. But on the other hand, when you don't know, you don't know. So I was sitting there in this room thinking, what does this all mean? And so finally, when the meeting ended, I rushed to the phone and I called my wife Jeannie, who's here tonight, and she was the one who told me that not only had everybody been released, but there was this reset in U.S.-Cuban relations. And we both teared up. I mean, it was an interesting thing for me because I did not expect to have that reaction. 5 years ago, I didn't know who the Cuban Five were. So in that sense, it was not. It was one of those things that where my reaction surprised me. I do know that winning the release of the five has not been easy, and there were a lot of things that happened, and we have heard in the news about the role of the Pope, the role of my country, Canada, in supplying, we're going to take credit in supplying a place for the talks that took place, the secret talks between the U.S. and Cuba. And there's even, as you all know now, the sperm diplomacy, as it's been called, that helped to cement this deal. But I think there are a couple of things that get left out of that discussion in the mainstream. One of which is the role of the Cuban government. The Cuban government was incredibly steadfast for 14 years in this fight. And, if you believed what you heard from the U.S. State Department, they would never release the five. These were people who were involved in spying and stealing military secrets and murder, and there was no way that they would ever be released. And there was certainly no way that there would ever be a deal for Alan Gross, because Alan Gross was an innocent humanitarian. These guys were spies. And they never wavered, the Cuban government never wavered in its support for those five. Perhaps more significant in some ways is that the Cuban Five never wavered. These were guys who were in jail for long periods of time. They were offered all sorts of inducements. I don't know if you remember, but René Gonzalez, who was one of the five, when he was in jail and he was awaiting trial, the U.S. government came to him and said, we know we don't have very much on you. We will offer you money, new identity, anything you want in order for you to plead guilty. That was the carrot. The stick was that his wife was in Florida, Olga. And if you don't agree to sign this confession, you'll never see your wife again. With his wife's support, René took that confession, and the place where his signature was supposed to go, he drew a middle finger, and he handed it back to them. And the next day, his wife was deported back to Cuba, and he did not see her for 13 years, I think it was, before she actually was able to see him. Gerardo, perhaps even more so. Here was a guy who had been sentenced to not one life term, but 2 life terms plus 15 years. He was never going to get out of jail. It was that simple. And I think many of us, even those of us who have been involved in this struggle in one way or another, actually didn't believe he would ever get out of jail. And he not only never wavered, but he had he said something wonderful at one point where he said that my only regret is that I only have 1 life to give for those 2 life sentences. And I think the third thing that is really important in terms of this story and what happened is the role of the solidarity movement here in the United States, but also across the world. Some of you have probably been involved for a lot longer than I have. Over the last number of years, I got to meet some really incredible people, some of whom are not with us anymore. Lenny Weinglass, who I was on one panel with, and Saul Lando, and I was on a couple with him, and both of those people have died. But the contributions that they made to this cause were pretty incredible. There's no credit in the mainstream media for any of that, of course, but you deserve credit, the people who have worked so hard on this. And it's been interesting in other ways. I am one of those people who accidentally fell into the story of the Cuban Five and writing about it, but so have a lot of other people. And one of them, I'm just going to mention one person, and that's a woman named Jacqueline Roussy. She's a French woman. She went on a vacation with her husband to Cuba in 2003 and saw signs about the Cuban Five. And when she came back, she began writing letters and began a correspondence in 2004. And in 2006, She convinced 63 of her neighbors in a village in the southwest of France to write a letter to the U.S. Attorney General at the time, Alberto Gonzalez, calling on him to free the five. She didn't get a response to that, but that didn't stop her, because after Barack Obama was elected in 2008, she began to write monthly letters. Every month, on the 5th of every month, which was considered the sort of the day to mark their continued imprisonment, she would write another letter to President Obama asking him to free the five. And she began to sort of circulate that to other people, to what she called personalities in the United States. And after this was all over, and I wrote to her, and I was just sort of having a correspondence with her, she wrote back and said, I had never received a response from any of these figures, including the president, but I have never been discouraged. I knew that justice would ultimately prevail. So I think that, a lot of people have a lot to celebrate in this, but there's, obviously one of the things that you discover is that when you solve one problem, there's always other problems to deal with, and there are struggles still ahead in terms of the five, in terms of really ending the embargo, in terms of stopping what the United States loves to call democracy promotion programs in Cuba, which are actually regime change programs. But that's really for the future. So, now is a time when people have the right to celebrate what actually happened. I think of this in a way at heart as a love story, a series of love stories in a sense. There's the love of country, the love of families, the families that supported these guys throughout those years. But my favorite story, and I think probably I'm not alone in this, is the story of Gerardo and Adriana, that love story. And I'm just going to read a couple of little excerpts from the book that are about that. And back in, I think it was 1987, 88, they met. He was a 21-year-old university student. She was 16. To get to university, he had to get up at 4 in the morning and take 3 different buses. Luckily, his father had a car and would usually drop him off within walking distance of the school on his way to work. In exchange, Gerardo washed his father's car. But one day, when his father asked him to wash it, Gerardo begged off, claiming he was too busy. You're never too busy when you need a ride, his father said. Gerardo took offense. It kind of hurt my teenager feelings, even though I was already in my 20s, he told me. So the next morning, he got up before dawn to make the long journey to school on his own. He'd made it as far as the 3rd and final bus stop on his journey when he noticed her. She was standing in line with some friends. For reasons he would never be able to explain, he says it was love at first sight. For him, it was love at first sight. For her, not so much. He put his eye on me, Adriana would tell me later with a laugh, but I didn't notice him, not then. By the next day, she didn't have a choice. Gerardo, who had once again skipped the convenience of a drive to school with his father in order to take the bus to make the arduous journey, in order to see her again, handed her a poem he'd written during his international law class the day before. Entitled Poem to the Girl at the Bus Stop. He entitled it that because he didn't know her name at this point. It began, and remember, he's writing this in class. I can hardly make out the figure before me, bent over, making didactic gestures, legal concepts, and international conflicts. The details almost make it to my ears, but my mind is filled with that girl at the bus stop. You may be surprised to know that Adriana was still not won over. I wasn't interested in a relationship at that time. So to discourage him, she got up before her own usual time the next morning and took an earlier bus. The day after that, Gerardo showed up even earlier and was already waiting. He had a poem, another poem, and roses which he'd stolen from a neighbor's garden. Perhaps before she did, Adriana's friends were quick to realize that something was happening. They held the seats for Gerardo and Adriana on the bus and then talked among themselves, so I had to talk to him, or Adriana told me. Not that it turned out to be such a difficulty. He was a gentleman with a sense of humor, and he wasn't hard on the eyes either. You can see in that passage Gerardo's persistence and his passion, which both served him very well as the years went by. By the time he arrived in Florida in 1994 to take up the role that would get him arrested 4 years later, he and Adriana had in fact been married for 6 years. Despite the fact that they shared every confidence and they would each tell me that the other was their best friend, he could not tell her what he was in fact doing in Florida. The mission was so secret that it was all on a need-to-know basis, and if you didn't need to know, you couldn't know, and for very good reason. Because if word leaked, somebody would find out, somebody would say something to somebody else, and that whole mission would be in jeopardy because he was there illegally operating under a fake name. And in fact, what he was doing, he was in charge of this network called the WASP network, and he supervised probably 24 agents altogether who were busy infiltrating these Florida terrorist groups. Throughout all of the 4 years that he was there, and this was really interesting in terms of my research. I read the transcripts of the trial and the boxes of evidence that had been gathered by the FBI. They had snuck in and copied the diskettes that they were sending back and forth to Havana. So they had everything, but that everything included the letters that Gerardo would write to Adriana, but they also included the letters he would write back to his bosses in Havana. And you can see this pattern that develops over the 4 years. He wanted Adriana to be with him in Florida, and he was pitching his bosses sometimes in roundabout ways and sometimes more directly. In 1997, the year before he was arrested, he typed, I don't know, all I saw is the typed version, but he wrote a 10-page single-spaced memo back to his bosses in Havana. And Gerardo was this kind of interesting sort of very detail-oriented kind of person who was very interested in weighing pros and cons. And that's what he did. For 10 pages, he weighed the pros and cons of having Adriana join him and having Adriana not join him. You won't be surprised how it turned out at the end of the 10 pages. He wanted her with him. And that because they had been talking each time he would go back to Havana for a vacation, they'd been talking about having children. That was their goal. And so he made it clear to his bosses back in Havana that if they let Adriana come to Florida with him, he was prepared to wait a little while on the having children. But if not, he wasn't. They were going to have children, and essentially Havana would have to deal with it, I guess, is what it came down to. So he never got a response to that message. It just didn't come back. And those of you who know the Cubans know that they don't often tell you no. They just don't answer your questions if they don't want to tell you no. So that I think is what happened in this case. So he didn't get that. So the last time he visited Havana before he was arrested was in December, January of 1998, 9 months before he was arrested. And this next passage is just a really short description of what happened on that vacation. He and Adriana had spent their brief vacation time together running against time, living each day as if it were our last. Adriana booked off her job. Gerardo drove the car his father had left to him. They visited family, friends. They stayed in a hotel in Veradero, stopped in to see her grandparents in Villa Clara. They had their favorite foods, pizza and ice cream, every day. She joked that she'd gained 20 pounds. She hadn't, of course, but even if she had, she would still have been as beautiful to him. They'd sat on the Alarcón watching the water, revisited the sacred ground near Morro Castle where they'd shared their first kiss, danced till dawn at Havana discos. Gerardo is a better dancer than me, Adriana would tell me, but neither of us is a great dancer. We're not even good dancers. We just enjoy dancing together. On December 31st, they'd had a party with friends to celebrate the new year, Adriana's birthday, and their upcoming 10th wedding anniversary, which they knew they wouldn't be together to celebrate in July. They'd kidded each other that they would have to stage a party like this every 5 years in order to celebrate their marriage, but they were just kidding. They had talked again with more urgency about finding some way and soon to be together all the time, to have that baby they talked about. And then too soon the visit was over. The taxi's here, Adriana said. She told him she'd rather not go with him to the airport. Gerardo said his goodbyes to the assembled friends and relatives and slowly made his way to the taxi. He put his bag in, got inside, got out again, came back to the house. He put his arms around Adriana. "I was missing you already, my queen," he said. They shared one last long embrace, and then he was gone. And that was the last time they would see each other for 14 years. The United States refused to provide a visa so that she could visit him in jail at all during all that time. And as many of you know, that became a big issue. It changed in the last couple of years, not because of the desire of the U.S. government to do anything nice for Gerardo and Adriana, but because they wanted to try and get conditions improved for Alan Gross. And so there was a couple of opportunities where they had visits, but they were not conjugal visits. And you can't have a conjugal visit apparently in a federal maximum security prison, which is what he was in. So most of us had come to the conclusion that there would never be this child that they wanted. He would never get out, that there would never be a child. But as part of those 18 months of secret negotiations, of course, this is where the Pope comes in, and I think it's actually quite wonderful. The Pope and Senator Leahy from Vermont, who got involved, and as a result of artificial insemination, Adriana got pregnant. And when you think about it, nobody could have known probably when this exchange was going to happen that happened on December 17th. But by the time it did, and the first pictures of Adriana and Gerardo together embracing came back, it was clear she was having a baby and very soon. And she had the baby early in January. Gemma was born. January what?
It was January 6th, which is Three Kings Day. I sent a letter to Leahy's office and said he's the fourth king.
January 6th, baby Gemma is born. Just this week I got an email from Gerardo. And if you've followed this story at all, you have seen the incredible outpouring in Cuba when they arrived back, the parties, the concerts, the celebrations, the picture of them here, there, and everywhere else. You know that they're being feted and dragged around. And of course, in the middle of all of this, there is this baby being born. And so in his email, Gerardo is apologizing for not having gotten back to me sooner. But he says at the end, this is the end of the email, he says, "We'll keep in touch. Adriana sends her best. Our little girl is wonderful. We are so," and this is in capital letters, "happy." I have to go now and change some diapers. Gerardo. Thank you very much. I would be happy to answer any questions.
What was the spark?
The spark was a total accident. I had decided I was going to write a novel, a love story, and I had it all figured out in my head what kind of love story it was going to be. And it was going to be based partly in Cuba and partly in Nova Scotia. And I'll tell you the reason, the cold winter that we brought down here, I was thinking that researching this book in the winter would be kind of nice. And so that was I was going to go to Cuba in the winter and research this novel. And when I got to Cuba, I hired a guide, a wonderful guy named Alex Trellis, who described himself as the red sheep of his family. And everybody else in his family went to Miami. He'd stayed in Cuba. He'd worked in the Ministry of the Interior. He'd had a falling out with them and ended up as a kind of gray market guide. So he guided people like me around who wanted to see the Havana that I wouldn't see as a tourist. So we spent a couple of days tooling around in his Lada, and it was just this wonderful experience. And we ended up back at the Hotel Nacional, and we were sitting out on the balcony overlooking the Bay of Havana, smoking cigars and drinking mojitos. And we were waxing about important issues, the one of which was the election of Obama. And I said in my naive way, do you think that things are going to improve now that Obama is the president? And he's turned to me and he said, nothing will change about U.S.-Cuba relations until they solve the problem of the five. And I didn't actually understand what he meant by that. And then he started to explain. And I think as a writer, where I got hooked on the story was not initially about the injustice or the politics of it, but when he told me that Gabriel Garcia Marquez had played a role. Gabriel Garcia Marquez takes a secret message from Fidel Castro to Bill Clinton about these plots, and the U.S. sends a delegation of FBI agents to Havana to meet with the Cuban state security, and 3 months later, instead of arresting the terrorists that the Cubans had pointed out, they arrest the Cuban intelligence agents. When that happened, when he said that, I thought, okay, there's a story here. And so when I went back to Canada, I began to investigate, and I found a copy of the transcript of the trial. And then the more I read through that transcript, it was 20,000 plus pages. I don't know if those of you who use Microsoft Word will probably understand this, but when you hit 20,000 pages, the little thing the little bar at the bottom which tells you how many pages it is, it stops showing you that. It gives you an asterisk, right? So after 20,000 pages, it was just this asterisk thing. But as I read that, it was like a light went on. They didn't do anything. They weren't doing anything to harm or endanger the American government or the American people. They were trying to stop terrorist attacks against their own country. They were trying to protect their homeland. And by the time I went down there was clearly after 9/11 and all that stuff. And I started to think, okay, what would, if you flip this story on its head and thought about what would have happened if before 9/11 the United States had agents inside Al-Qaeda. Those agents had discovered the plot to blow up the World Trade Center, attack the Pentagon, and reported back to Washington. And Washington had taken that information and shared it with the Afghan government. And the Afghan government, instead of arresting the terrorists, had arrested the agents. You can imagine what the situation would have been like in the United States, how the United States would have responded to that. And that is essentially, from the Cuban point of view, their country was under threat of attack by terrorist groups in the United States who were, if not sponsored by the United States, allowed to operate by the United States. They looked the other way when it came to attacks on Cuba. And those attacks had in fact produced some horrific violence in Cuba. In 1997, there were more than a dozen tourist hotels that were attacked by these terrorist groups, and bombs had been set off there. There was an Italian-Canadian who was killed in one of those attacks. And there was an incredible amount of property damage and a lot of injuries. One of the waiters at the famous Hemingway bar, the Bodeguito del Medio, will never hear again because he just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And there were others who were badly hurt. So, at that point, I realized that this is not just an interesting story, but it's a story about an injustice that, to me, didn't matter what your politics was. This was an injustice that needed to be righted. And so that's what, and as a journalist, I'm not used, that's a very uncomfortable place for me to be, is to become an advocate for something. But in this case, I felt that was necessary. And as time went on, I guess I've become more of an advocate. That, each time I would do something in pursuing this story, I remember the first time I marched outside the White House. I have not marched outside anything since I was in my 20s, and this was not something that I would, I'm holding the thing and I'm looking around thinking, why am I doing this? But I felt like I had to. And again, the lobbying that was done, the International Committee, I was peripheral to it. I was there, but I felt like, if I could go and explain what I had found out to people, that they would actually, pay attention and do something. That was pretty naive too. But I think in a sense, we were all part of that. What Gerardo Hernandez called the jury of millions, right? Which is, it was convincing one person at a time that something wrong had happened and something needed to be righted. I don't think that what happened on December 17th would have happened if all of the people who have been protesting for all of these years had not been doing that. It would have been so easy for this to have been dismissed and forgotten. So the people who were out marching and doing that, really did accomplish something. And that's, I think, more of you are activists than I am, certainly, but I think that's a pretty amazing accomplishment, that something did happen as a result of all the work that people put in. That was a long answer to your question, sorry.
Appreciate it, thank you.
Yes?
You thought Gerardo, at a certain stage anyway, thought Gerardo would never get out.
Mm-hmm.
But you also said the confidence that they had, which I think was very important. They always thought they were going to get out. They never let go. They were going to get them out.
And I think that was probably not only really important for them, and I think there were almost certainly times when they despaired. I mean, you'd be hard pressed not to. But certainly in the time that I've been corresponding with Gerardo, and I probably had 100, 150 letters back and forth, I've been amazed by just how strong he was throughout this and how positive he was. And we would correspond about things like Alan Gross and Judy Gross, and he was very perceptive about the importance of Alan Gross as part of the strategy for getting out. He also, this was not me so much as hearing about this sort of secondhand, but from inside prison, the International Committee, the people who were sort of close to him, Alicia and Bill, in terms of talking to him on a regular basis, he was giving them instructions, right? Alicia describes herself, or I think he described her as his secretary, right, at some point. And part of that was, did you hear about this? You should check that out. And in fact, when I said the thing about Jeff De Laurentiis being in the U.S. interest section in Havana, I talked to some officials in the mission, the Cuban mission in Washington, and after we had this conversation, and I realized who he was, and the guy from the mission went home and did his Googling and discovered, it wasn't that they didn't necessarily know, but they didn't realize the import of this. He was on top of all of this stuff. And I had less correspondence with Ramón and Antonio. I had some, but not less with them, and a little bit with Fernando, but a lot also with René, who was the attitude, his was less political, I think, in some senses, in the fighting the cause. But what he did was he went in and he said, I am going to make the best of the next 15 years. He took up running. He became a marathon or half marathon runner while he was in prison. He studied, he taught other prisoners, and I think that publication you're connected with has written about some of that stuff, if I'm not mistaken.
Voices from Prison.
Yes, and one of the fascinating things to me was one of the people he served in prison with, after he was released, wrote about how René González had changed his life. You know, these were the guys who were so dangerous in American jails. Anyway, someone else there? Yes.
Could you provide any details of moments where Obama or other people in the administration did something good, noble, along the way in this development?
I think that my sense of the last 2 or 3 years has been that there's been an increasing recognition within the administration and elements in Congress that not so much that this was wrong, but this was counterproductive and something needed to change. But I think, if you look at the humanitarian side, I think, to me, the person who probably gets the most credit is Patrick Leahy, the Vermont senator, who he was the one who went to Havana, met with the wives of the 5, and discovered that, I don't know if he discovered in that, but he actually heard from Adriana the fact that she hadn't been able to see her husband for 14 years, and came back, and it was through his office that the first visit came about. And I gather there's somebody in his office that we've met with on a number of occasions, a guy named Tim Reiser, who the first time that I did the lobbying and we went through this day, we tried not to confess just how depressed we were, I think, by the kind of responses we were getting from people. And then the last meeting of the day, which Ellen arranged with Tim Reiser, and we went into this appropriations committee room, right? I stole the Senate, one of those little coffee things. I still have at home, which I managed to steal that day. But we're all sitting around this appropriations committee, and he is talking about the 5, and he understood the case, which nobody else did at that point. And he also talked about things, he told us you can't talk about this, but he did tell us about efforts that were being made, and that things, the sense that things were happening. And we went back to see him a couple of more times over the period of time, and he never gave anything away. And he was also in close contact with Alan Gross and his family. But it was clear that they had a sense that something needed to be done, not just for practical reasons, but for humanitarian reasons, and that they were actually trying to make things better. So if you're looking for somebody who actually did try to make a difference, I would say it was Patrick Leahy and the people on his staff. That would be my sense of it. Anyone else? Yes?
Can you talk about whatever role the Canadian government played, and why you think they were effective, why they were selected? Any comments you have on that, in that nature?
I do not want to give credit to our current Canadian government for almost anything. I'll say that off the top. But having said that, we have a long history with Cuba. Our Canadian people, not only as tourists, but Pierre Trudeau, who was Prime Minister of the country, and Fidel Castro got along so well that Fidel Castro was, I think, an honorary pallbearer at Trudeau's funeral. And I think that the Cubans and the Americans were both looking for a place to hold these secret talks that was not in either country. This was not going to happen in Washington, and it was not going to happen in Havana. They needed to be able to go somewhere different. And Ottawa was probably big enough that that could happen without word necessarily leaking out that these conversations were happening. And I think they had 7 meetings in Canada over the course of the 18 months. So that, I think that Canada's role was we didn't do anything, I don't think, other than to provide a place and an opportunity for the discussions to take place. My understanding is that Pope Francis was much more important in that when things weren't going well, he wrote to both the leaders in Cuba and Washington and said, smarten the hell up, get this done. I mean, it was and pushed them in I guess only the way a pope can, and as a result of that, I think that things moved forward. And there were all kinds of problems along the way, things where it almost went off the rails. One that we know about, because it also happened to coincide with the time when we were in Washington, was the release of Bergdahl, the American soldier. There was a deal made for him. And when I first heard that, I thought, well, maybe this is a good thing, that that they've actually done a deal, so maybe things will move forward. But it turned out that there was such controversy about that deal that people thought that was going to be the end of it, that they were that the U.S. would be frightened off of making any other arrangement. But I guess, as time went on, it was clear that was a big deal for a moment, but not a big deal in the long run. I think that the other thing that I think is worth thinking about here is when the United States actually made the deal, they were so anxious to make it clear that this wasn't an Alan gross for the remainder of the Cuban Five, that this guy who nobody had heard of, who's supposedly been in jail for 20 years, suddenly becomes the central figure in all of this. And the United States traded the 3 Cuban spies for this one guy, and Alan gross was just sort of thrown in as a humanitarian gesture. As if you've been following what's happened since, it's become interesting. There are people who will tell you, these are people who claim to know about American intelligence. There are people who tell you, yes, he was very important and he helped to uncover the Cuban Five network, and that he helped to uncover Ana Montes and others who were involved in spying. And then you have other people still on the same side, saying that no, in fact, they still think he was a double agent planted by Cuba. Cuba's ability to sow confusion about who's on whose side, and one of the things I remember when I was researching the book, there were militant anti-Cuban organizations, and when they would meet in Miami, the opening of the meeting would be, welcome to our friends in the boom, welcome to the agents of the FBI, the CIA, and the Cuban state security, because they knew they were infiltrated by just about everybody. And you had and they were, and you had these really interesting moments when somebody who was a very prominent anti-Cuban official would suddenly turn around and say, I've been working for Castro all along. I've been working for the Cubans. And so nobody knew who was doing what after a while. And that was probably one of the joys from the Cuban point of view, is that they were never able to figure out who was who. So it may be that this guy is a legitimate person. And in fact, if what we're told is true, that he was in jail in Cuba for the last 20 years, that's probably not fake. That's probably real. But one never knows, and that makes it much more interesting and entertaining.
When you are not able, for security reasons, valid reasons, to be able to tell your closest companion or whatever, you know, that you're actually carrying out work in defense of the revolution, when on the surface you've left the country, you're working with and publicly identifying with all these counter-revolutionary organizations, and that has to be your persona. How does that, you know, how does that, in terms of the relationship, and because, you know, the companion is loyal to the revolution, and yet the person that they think, you know, that they're in love with seems to be on the side of the counter-revolution. How is that worked out? How does that psychologically, how do those relationships continue?
Labanino, who his cover story was that he was working for a Cuban national organization in Spain, right? So he was supposedly in Spain, and after a while his wife got suspicious, and they had a fight about was he having an affair. And so he had to change his story, but still not give away the truth. And probably the most poignant story to me was René and Olga. René, his cover story was that he defected. He stole a plane in Cuba and flew to the United States and announced that he was defecting. And he was on the news, and he was this. Olga was not allowed to know any of this, his wife. And so she gets home from a day of work, and they come and tell her that her husband has defected. When he gets to Miami, the Cubans obviously spent a lot of time figuring out who to assign to these jobs, because they had to have an incredible ability to compartmentalize those sorts of things. But René got to Miami, and he was met by the Cuban Americans, and he was welcomed with open arms, and they took him out to dinner, and they put him up in a hotel, and he gets in the hotel, and he has a shower, and he turns on the TV, and it's sort of Spanish things. He's not really paying attention. The only thing he brought with him, because he was born in the United States, was an American passport, and in his wallet were pictures of his wife and his daughter, and he cried. And he wrote her a letter in character after he was in the United States saying, I have discovered this wonderful land of opportunity. I found a school for our daughter. I want you to join us. And that would have been, you know, he would not necessarily have explained to her what was going on, but he really wanted her there with him. And she wrote back, and he told me that he was in Sarasota, I think it was, when the letter arrived at his grandmother's in I forget the actual. So he drove back really excited to see her, because he'd written this letter, and her letter said essentially, I am glad that you have found this new life, but it will not be with me. And that was, you know, absolutely devastating. He spent the next 4 years trying to win her back. And I mean, there's two sides to this story. I mean, he's desperately trying to win her back without giving up his story. But at the same time, in Cuba, they are not telling her anything because, again, as I said, that would, you know, the potential for compromising what he was actually trying to do if anybody finds out. So she and her daughter are in a neighborhood. Their father's a traitor, and there's taunts to Irma about this at school. Olga decides to move to another neighborhood to try and escape this, moves to a worse neighborhood. They're robbed, they lose all of their possessions. Then they're put into a shelter, and the staircase, this is one of the old buildings in Havana, and the staircase collapses. All this is happening while her husband is being a hero to the Cuban nation, except nobody knows it. And if you can imagine how, I mean, I can't imagine how tough that would have been. In the end, and this is the reason supposedly why the Cuban government would not allow Olga to visit, was because in 1996, the Cuban government, largely at Gerardo's pushing, agreed to tell Olga what was going on and to allow her to move to Florida to join him. And that, they had 2 years. I think everybody understood the fiction that was going on, but they did train her a little bit in techniques that she could use. The closest she came to spying, according to any of the information that was there, was that she went to a party. She really hated being with all these people that she detested, right? And that he had to, he had to party with. So she wasn't very helpful in getting information because she really didn't want anything to do with this. And then, of course, she had a baby, and she wasn't, she had no interest in the intelligence side. They were just back together. And then after he was arrested, the U.S. government tried to use her as a pawn to force him to, that, as I said before, to force him to confess, and he wouldn't. But yeah, I cannot imagine what that must have been like. I've talked to them about it, and I remember Gerardo said of René, as you know, there were the Cuban Five were actually 10 agents that were arrested back in -- 5 of them did cop to pleas and that, but Gerardo said that those 5, were mostly couples, and they had kids, and so it was understandable that they would do that, and that made it that much more significant that René refused to, given that they had almost nothing on him, and they would, they really wanted his case to be pushed aside, and then they could claim that one more person had pled guilty, but he wouldn't. I'm just going to let that stand because I think, I agree with you. I think that.
Could you repeat the question?
For the camera. The question essentially was is this not part of the Cuban character, or the Cuban Revolution, the result of that, the solidarity that they showed? And as I said, I don't know that I have any other comment to make other than to let your comment stand on that.